So causal loop diagrams are a really common systems thinking tool. Causal loop diagrams essentially allow us to map a model of the system in a way that kind of captures the inputs and the outputs and any changes that are happening in the system over time. And the good thing about causal loop diagrams is we can use them to kind of tell a story about what is happening in the system. So there are a couple of common system archetypes that exist. There are 8 or 12 depending on who you talk to, but there are 8 to 12 really common archetypes that we see happening in a system. So I'm going to show you 4 of these, and I'm also going to show you how a causal loop diagram can be created for a couple of different systems. So the first thing that we put in a causal loop diagram is the variables. So for this first example, which will illustrate a fixes that fail archetype, I'm going to use the example of something that I saw on the news the other day. So a lack of teachers, particularly here in Queensland, where there is not a lot of people wanting to work in schools and they're facing teaching shortages. So the solution that I saw proposed by the Queensland government was incentivizing teaching degrees. So they're making teaching more enticing for people to want to go and study teaching at university so that we can then in turn have more teachers. So these are our 2 variables that we're starting with, and we're going to draw an arrow from this one because this is the direction that the causal relationship is. And what happens here is we're asking what would happen if this variable increased. This variable increased. So if we had a lack of teachers and it's continuing to increase, so we're having less teachers, then the incentivization of teaching degrees is going to increase. What then happens is, with more people studying this, we will no longer have this lack of teachers. So as this variable increases, the lack of teachers is actually going to decrease. So this is a positive relationship, this is a negative causal relationship, and overall, the plus and the minus balance each other out. So this is a balancing feedback loop. What that essentially means is that although there might be some fluctuations, generally the overall trend is that it will remain the same. But when we look at this over time, we have an unintended consequence. So this is a short-term solution that's not really addressing the root cause of the problem. So we have our unintended consequence, which might be that they're not paid enough, burnt out, maybe they are overworked and not supported enough in their roles. So this is the unintended consequence that's happening because we didn't actually address the root cause. And so what happens is, if we take this incentivizing of teaching degrees and we link it to our other variable, we will notice that this actually increases. So this is a plus. And as we have more of our unintended consequences, so as we have more teachers that aren't being paid enough, teachers that are burnt out, teachers that are overworked and not supported, they're inevitably going to quit. And so we have a lack of teachers again. And so as this one increases, this one is also increasing. And because we have more pluses than we have minuses in this feedback loop, it's a reinforcing feedback loop. What that means is that it is reinforcing, it is allowing this to continue to happen and continue to change. So a balancing feedback loop indicates some kind of stability in the system. A reinforcing feedback loop indicates some kind of change, whether that is growth or decline. So overall, this would lead us, if we looked at it over time, to see that maybe in the beginning things were the same, but then we come back to this, and so we have the problem overall of a lack of teachers. So that's an example of fixes that fail. Now, in drifting goals, we generally have two parties in the system, two kind of groups in the system that have different goals. So this could apply to an ecosystem where you have maybe like two different animals that are competing for different things within an ecosystem. It happens in social systems. And so I'm going to use the example of a healthcare system. So we have some kind of gap to begin with. That's our first variable. Now, the gap is a gap in the goals or what the two different parties are desiring. So the first party might be the hospital or the GP's office, and they are feeling like they are under pressure to reduce the time that is spent with each patient. So they have pressure to reduce the time with patients. What that then leads to is another variable, which is the level of care that they can provide. So if there's an increase in pressure, an increase in that variable, it will lead to a decrease in the level of care. This is what the healthcare providers want. They want to be able to spend more time with patients. This is what the patients want. They want people to spend more time with them and listen to what they're saying. So this is what we want. We want the level of care to increase. Now, as the level of care increases, the pressure to reduce the time spent with patients is also going to increase because we want to see more results happening. But as there's pressure to reduce the patient time, that ultimately means that the level of care might reduce. So because we have a minus here and we have a plus for this part, this is a balancing feedback loop. Now, here is where the gap is created. We also have the corrective action that we're taking. As we're spending more time with patients, it means that our funding opportunities are going to be increasing because we are ultimately achieving a higher level of care. As funding opportunities increase from, say, the government, it means that there is pressure for less time to be spent with patients because, again, we want to increase the level of care. So as funding is increasing, we're actually decreasing the amount of time that we're able to spend with patients. And so again, we have a balancing feedback loop. So overall, this is a system that is experiencing some fluctuations, but overall it's remaining fairly stable. Shifting the burden is another example of a system archetype that we can see if we use a causal loop diagram. And I'm going to use a really common example that we see in the development space, which is to do with the eradication of poverty and supporting innovation within this space. So we have our first kind of main variable, which is the level of poverty someone is experiencing. Now, the more poverty someone experiences, the more external support they're going to need. Whether that is support from a government or a donor agency, whatever it might be, they're going to need more external support. Now, as the external support increases, it means that the poverty level will likely decreases, and that leads to relative stability. We could also have another variable, which would be, I guess, the opposite of external support, and that would be kind of intrinsic motivation or innovation to create change. Now, obviously, people in poverty are somewhat limited by this because they don't have access to all of the resources and things that they need to self-innovate. So we can assume that as the poverty level increases, the self-innovation and self-motivation would also increase. Now, as our self-innovation and self-motivation increases, what happens to the poverty level? Poverty level, we can assume, would decrease. So again, we have another balancing feedback loop. When the burden is shifting between external support and internal support, we have an unintended consequence. And this comes from external support. it could lead to a reliance on external support. So if external support increases, we could potentially increase in the individual or community's reliance on that external support, which could potentially decrease in their self-motivation or self-innovation. So here our external support could lead to a reliance on external support, which could lead to a decrease in self-innovation, and again, a increase in external support. So overall, we have a reinforcing feedback loop. So here what we would probably see is over time there would be a general increase or decrease, so a general kind of change in the system, but it would be very slow because we have a lot more stability in the system compared to change. Finally, we can look at one that I think is familiar to a lot of people, and this is the archetype of success to the successful. And I think the best way to exemplify this is through our economic system. This is a classic example of why we see people who come from positions of privilege continue to succeed and be able to access resources more easily than those who don't come from positions of privilege. So the first variable we have is the resources that are available to Group A. Now, as these resources increase and they have more resources, it means that their success is also going to increase. What that then means in turn is if they are more successful, we're going to see that the allocation of support, resources, etc. is also going to increase. And what happens if the allocation of support or resources is increasing? Means they have more resources available. So this is an overwhelmingly positive feedback loop. And this is a reinforcing feedback loop. It's going to reinforce any change or movement. Now, what happens if there is an allocation of more resources to this group of people? It means that there's going to be less resources for the second group. So as the allocation of resources increases for A, then resources for B is going to decrease. What happens if we have less resources available for Group B? It means they're going to be less successful. And what happens if Group B is less successful? There are less resources. So this, again, is a reinforcing feedback loop because there are more of one than this. So it's not going to balance itself out. It's going to reinforce. And so here we can clearly see why, over time, with two reinforcing feedback loops, change is going to happen like this. So hopefully that kind of gives you guys just a little bit of an idea of what system archetypes are and how causal loop diagrams can be used to understand the dynamics of a system and how systems change over time. If you want to learn more, you can definitely read about this in Opening the Black Box, which is the second social change handbook published by the Humanitarian Changemakers Network, which if you head to humanitarianchangemakers.net, you can download an ebook for as little as a $3 donation.